Hey everyone, this is Chad with Cosmic Mind Astrology. So I'm going to do a pretty deep dive into the upcoming Saturn-Neptune conjunction that will be peaking actually in 2026, and will basically be at its height in the years 2025 and 2026. However, if you use a 15-degree orb, which was basically what Richard Tarnas recommended in his book Cosmos and Psyche, or what he found to be significant for specifically cycles of Saturn to an outer planet. And so from his research, right, he found that there was pretty significant correlations that began to emerge within that 15-degree orb range. You can even extend that to 20 if you want. Just in my own research on this specific cycle, I did find the 15-degree orb to be pretty interesting and pretty insightful. And there were definitely pretty notable correlations within that. But of course, all this stuff is very much subject to various different theories and ideas, and it really is not a hugely organized effort. So basically, we have, a handful basically of key figures in the astrology world who have really done much research around, or this type of research specifically with mundane astrology. And I want to just mention something about that really quickly, which is that this is the way that I'll be talking about this information is fairly new. It's a modern way of doing what is called mundane astrology. And if you're not familiar with that term, mundane astrology is just basically the astrology of world events and political affairs and natural disasters, or basically astrology that looks at collective population level changes. Okay. So this is actually a pretty old astrology. In fact, this goes back thousands of years. If you look into the astrology of, basically Mesopotamia, Babylon, up Egypt, right, up through ancient Greece, Rome, right, astrology was very much concerned with collective level affairs, right, especially political changes and things of that nature. In fact, astrology in antiquity had a lot of power, actually, and a lot of decisions were based on astrology. Astrology wasn't the sole basis for that, but there were a lot of different basically different oracular divinatory methods that were used to make critical political decisions, right? And astrology was one of those. Um, Mundane astrology is a really ancient technique of using the positions of planets, stars, whatever, to determine what is going to happen on Earth, right? And there's lots of ideas as to how that comes about. My personal view on this is really that astrology reflects life on Earth, so it doesn't actually cause things to happen. So I do not believe that the alignment of Saturn and Neptune is going to influence things on Earth. Um, I do have some nuance in that, it's particularly with things like eclipses and um, emotional shifts and things like that, where I do think in some ways there could be some causative effect. But ultimately, my view is that astrology reflects symbolically what is happening down here. Okay. And so I am not claiming that this alignment is going to be making things happen. So just to be clear on that, so my worldview is very much kind of hermetic, basically saying that everything is ultimately interconnected and moving together. And so from that worldview, from that perspective, it makes logical sense that the sky would reflect our life. Okay. So so basically, right, this way of doing astrology is that I'm going to be talking about, that Richard Tarnas has really revolutionized, and he was actually also really inspired by other mundane astrologers that have been working in the 20th century. One very notable astrologer was André Barbault, and Barbault was a French mundane astrologer who has produced a huge amount of work, and actually recently passed away in 2019 at the age of 98. And he was almost 100 years old, and I believe had been studying astrology since he was like 19 or something. And so he spent most of his life steeped in this research. And has been a huge influence on the field of mundane astrology. So a lot of what Tarnas expanded on, Barbault was very influential in that. And so I actually want to mention Barbault's work today in this video and podcast because I wrote a big article on this topic, this alignment of Saturn and Neptune, which I published September of last year. Now, um, I this article is pretty lengthy, and I was doing a lot of research on this for quite some time before I published it. And I wasn't rushed to finish it, but I basically had no specific deadline until I was invited to speak at Astrobash, which was an evolutionary astrology conference in Borrego Springs, California, last September. And so I decided to present some of this material there. And so I used that as a deadline to just finish my article. Otherwise, it would have not gotten done. Also, because I was returning to graduate studies basically a week after Astrobash. So it probably would have gotten shelved. So it was actually a really good incentive for me to finish that article. But there was a lot more I wanted to go into. And in fact, I was not as familiar with Barbault's work until quite recently. And that is actually because most of Barbault's work was published exclusively in French. And so, as far as I'm aware, there's only one book, at least that I've been able to find, that's in English, and it's an English translation. The last book I believe he wrote, which is Planetary Cycles, Mundane Astrology by André Barbault. And I highly recommend this book if you're interested in mundane astrology. You can find this easily on Amazon. And it's basically a huge summary of his work, basically his technique and all of the observations he made with a variety of different cycles, planetary cycles throughout history. So I'm going to mention Barbault today because he actually made a very specific prediction about 2026 that I think is really interesting. And it actually contradicted a lot of what I got about this cycle. And so I want to provide these different points of view because I think ultimately that is kind of the spirit of this approach to doing mundane astrology, which is this kind of empirical method of collecting data and discerning patterns in that data and basically tracking the development of specific events, political events, or what have you, or even things like natural disasters over time and seeing if there are connections between these specific cycles and these very specific events. And I would argue there is, and obviously Richard Tarnas would, since he wrote a pretty monumental book on this topic called Cosmos and Psyche. And I've cited this a lot in my past articles, especially on the topic of Saturn and Pluto, which I published predicting things that could happen in 2020 back in early 2019. Well, that's when I published it, but I had been working on that piece all throughout 2018 and actually wrote other articles on that going back to 2016. And again, Tarnas, of course, had pretty well fleshed out the nature of that cycle. And so lots of other astrologers had made predictions about 2020 being really significant. But yeah, so Richard Tarnas has done pretty interesting work in relation to all of this. Amazing work, and I would say pretty revolutionary in terms of really shifting the paradigm of mundane astrology and bringing in this more deeper archetypal analysis of these types of events. And that's something that I really have brought into my own work as well. Okay, so I'm going to basically go over my basically looking at Tarnas's analysis of this cycle and then some of my own findings in relation to it. And then I want to end with André Barbault's perspective on this cycle because these are kind of two different perspectives on it. And Barbault got a lot of different stuff from it that I think is really interesting and relevant and actually ties into a lot of my own research, which I think is interesting because I did that pretty much unaware of Barbault's analysis of the Saturn-Neptune cycle. So that's interesting because I did feel that I picked up some elements of what he was tracking as well. And also, for just so you know, that Richard Tarnas did not devote an entire chapter to the Saturn-Neptune cycle. So if you're familiar with Cosmos and Psyche, he devotes entire chapters to some very specific planetary cycles. But it's actually towards the end of the book that he discusses the Saturn-Neptune cycle. And he says a lot of really interesting stuff about it. And I think it is fairly accurate if you do look through time. when these alignments happen. And I really do feel he really fleshed out a very interesting perspective on it. So my article, which I will link down below in the YouTube video, and I'll have it in the show notes with the podcast, so you can check that out. Also, if you just go to my website, Cosmic Mind with a K, KOSMICMIND.com, you can also just find that article on the front page, as well as all my main articles that I've written in relation to mundane astrology. Okay, so this is a really complicated topic because, well, for a lot of reasons. So the first is that mundane astrology is inherently very complicated because not only are you tracking a specific cycle, but you also have to be conscious of the overlap of other planetary cycles happening at the same time. And this cycle in particular does actually occur alongside that of two other significant alignments, I think, that of Sedna and Uranus and Chiron and Eris. And these actually get into pretty close orb and alignments in that 2025-2026 time band as well. So I think that is really relevant. And I actually included those in my analysis in my Saturn-Neptune article as well. And I'm not going to really go into those at all today. I don't think. We'll see. But I think I'll leave that to those that want to read that, just because that would just add a lot more complexity to it. So, but for simplicity's sake, we will just say that because Neptune has been an archetype that has been pretty dominant in the collective consciousness since about the 1800s, and Saturn, of course, goes back to the advent of astrology and civilization, or awareness of it and paying attention to it, I would say that alignment itself is very much the focal point. But those other conjunctions, particularly with Aries, I mean, I do feel that Aries is a very significant archetype that is vying for our attention. I do think it is showing up pretty strongly in world events. And I do think it made a pretty pronounced appearance in the events of 2020 as well. And I talk about that in my article. So I think this Chiron Eris alignment is really interesting. Okay, so the other complex part of this as well is that the Neptune-Saturn conjunction will be occurring on the Aries point. And so the Aries point is basically just the first degree of tropical Aries. And that is actually where in the northern hemisphere, when the sun crosses that degree, that's basically the start of the spring equinox. And so the Aries point, technically in astrology, is actually any planets that are situated in the late mutable, so like the last 2 degrees of mutable signs. So like Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, okay, and early cardinal. So Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. So it's basically like seen as a 4-degree range of the zodiac, basically, that is considered the Aries point. And that's because planets, for example, in early Libra or late Virgo are in opposition to that Aries point, right? And in late Gemini, early Cancer are square to that, and so forth. Okay, so they're basically making hard aspects, and that's the idea there. And it is interesting, actually, and I talked about this in the last video that I did, where there are outer planet crossings of the Aries point, or especially alignments that happen there, I think are very significant. And I've been doing a lot of research on this over the last few years, and a lot, actually, more so recently, because I'm going to be presenting on this topic with NCGR San Diego this July, and I will actually include a link to that too. I don't believe my talk has been posted up there yet, but I will provide the link there so that whenever they do post that, you can actually register for that and you can view that through Zoom. And if you can't make the time, you can also just watch the recording at any point too. So in that talk, I'm going to be going pretty deeply into the symbolism of the Aries point. So I'm probably going to leave out most of that here simply because it's a whole other topic. But I'll just say that I think that the Aries point adds to the significance of this alignment, and it actually makes this alignment more meaningful and important, specifically for the entire world. So this is like speaking to global level events that have widespread ramifications. Okay, so either that meaning it literally affects like huge swaths of the planet, or the events that correlate with it have a deeply meaningful significance historically. So it's like in the future, these events are looked back on as being very significant in historical memory. There's a lot more to that. And again, I'm going to go over that in my talk. And in fact, I do a pretty good analysis of that as well in my article, and you can check that out. Okay. So, um, the other part, the reason I think this is really complicated is because of the political climate right now and the events that have been happening since the pandemic, especially, but even before that. In fact, the events that I would think that I believe actually have been spawned by the last square of this cycle, which occurred in the 2013-2016 time band. And if you remember 2016, especially if you are here in the United States, but even if you're elsewhere in the world, you probably are familiar with the election of Donald Trump and that all the controversy that was surrounding that and just all of that, the rise of populism here in the United States, both right wing and left wing, right? Bernie Sanders was hugely significant populist candidate as well that was competing in that election alongside that of Hillary Clinton, right? And so that last square, I think, is really significant because this conjunction, right, is the next stage of that cycle. And so a lot of events that will emerge in this new conjunction will be connected to those events as well. Um, Now, I'll come back to that. But so the last conjunction, however, of Saturn and Neptune was actually 1989. So this cycle is about 36 to 37 years. And 1989 is actually very interesting because this was basically the culmination, the ending of the Cold War, right? And leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's a hugely complicated topic that I am not an expert in at all. But the most symbolic event of that was actually the fall of the Berlin Wall, which actually did happen in 1989 in November of that year. And so that was really the symbolic, right, collapse of Soviet power. And lots of historians and academics really do look at that as a very significant moment in terms of changing power dynamics in the world, and particularly the United States, right, coming to become a very dominant world power. And its ideology of capitalism, which has evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective, into what many academics and journalists, and myself included, would call neoliberalism, or what I like to call hypercapitalism, which is basically an end stage form of capitalism that is basically funded, right? It's really propped up by the state. The state apparatus is very heavily involved in market interests to the point that now, right, there's actually a lot of market interests that control many government decisions that may not be very obvious to people because this is a very complicated issue. So I think that part is really interesting because there was this very powerful shift in power relations in the world at that time, right? And also the internet, right? The rise of the internet as this publicly accessible utility and the ramifications of that were just beginning to emerge into the world as well. Um, Lots of stuff were going on at that time. So, and the way that that was changing the way that humans were communicating with each other throughout the world as well, and the flow of commerce and all of that. Okay. I think the information part of it, though, is really interesting. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but just to state, right, that um, the hyper capitalistic system, right, the way that that actually worked with the internet to spread the internet throughout the world, right, and all these private industries have been involved in that as well. So very nuanced conversation. I think there's positives to it and lots of negatives as well, and so rather messy. So anyway, basically I wanted to just say that I think the political climate we're in right now is really complex because of the internet, actually, right? Because especially with social media, right, we are being fed a lot of media, a lot of information that's very tailored to our own specific biases and perspectives and worldviews, right? Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote a lot of crazy stuff, but I think he was pretty brilliant, called these reality tunnels, right? That we all have our own sort of like reality tunnels that we, transit through, right? And this is all how we see the world, and we're all kind of in our own reality tunnels. And today, right, with social media and things like YouTube, right, these algorithms are feeding us the information that we like, and sometimes feeding us information we don't like, because things that trigger us politically or ideologically or whatever, we tend to, click on, right, because it's clickbait, right? And so it creates this very kind of divisive environment, right? And I think that is very interesting, because I felt like that really culminated in that last square of Saturn and Neptune during that 2013-2016 period. And there was a lot of interesting things that happened there that in itself is hugely complicated. And I'm going to just briefly kind of go over some of that. Many things you might not actually be aware of because of the complexity of all this stuff. So, but the election of Donald Trump, right, and was this incredibly divisive moment, right? And I believe there was a lot of conflicting information from, both sides of the political aisle. There was a lot of confusion as to what was really going on. And to this day, a lot of people don't realize, things that were, promoted by the government or even by alternative media and so forth, right? That people believed have been found to be untrue, right? And many people still believe these things simply because they're in their own reality tunnels. And so people have a diverse range of opinions on all of this stuff because it's such a complicated matter. But anyway, I'm not going to get too deeply into that. But just to say that makes, I feel like, this cycle in particular very difficult to delineate fully and make predictions about, because it's like, you have to really be clear about your biases and what you believe and what you think. In fact, interestingly, that does seem to be a very interesting theme of this cycle. And that makes sense considering that Neptune, one of its correlations, right, is deception, delusion, right? It's the planet of illusion. It's the planet of fantasy. A lot more to that. It can actually be higher spiritual aspirations and vision and higher moral values, etc., right? And being drawn towards some greater purpose than oneself. And there's lots and lots of, so-called spiritual ideological correlations with Neptune. But one of its, challenging sides is that it can be strongly correlated with delusion and deception and not knowing what's real and what isn't. Okay. So, so I'm going to dive a little bit into that actually and just flesh out these archetypes real quickly before I continue on with this, with some of the political stuff as well. But so basically, right, the Neptune, so the Saturn-Neptune archetypes are very antithetical. And so what I mean by that is that they deal with very different domains of reality. But one of the things that I found and that I shared in my talk for Astrobash was the way in which they do actually share an underlying interest or theme, and that actually does relate to reality. And so, in fact, for example, astrologer Stephen Forrest, right, famously says that Saturn is like the brick wall of reality. It's a really good metaphor for that planet, right? Under Saturn cycles, it's like we're confronted with reality in a very, sometimes a very challenging way, very sobering way, right? We realize the limitations of ourselves, of our own lives, of our potential. And from an evolutionary astrological perspective, which is I very much come from, meaning I believe all of this is meaningful, and all of these cycles collectively, personally have a meaningful purpose. They're guiding us towards something, even though we might not ultimately know what that is, but it's a part of a process of expansion, growth, evolution, however you want to refer to it, spiritual growth as a human species and as individuals, right? So the purpose of that, right, though, is to help us mature, to grow, evolve, right? The ultimate objective of those hitting those limitations is to realize, basically to get things done, to realistically accomplish things in the world and within our own lives, right? And so it's interesting though, because, right, Neptune being the archetype of it's like fantasy, dreams, visions, aspirations, right? Those things are really important though, right? It's those higher aspirations and higher ideals, which, allow us to take action and to actually right? We have to make those things manifest, right? So those things serve as the inspiration for the Saturnian work that helps us to actually do that in the concrete world. Okay, so that's one piece of it. The other piece, though, is that, right, Saturn, I would say, relates to our concrete material reality, right? It relates to things we can tangibly touch, see, perceive, measure. Okay. So things like gravity, um, taxes, right, our mortality, the reality that we experience at various stages in our life, right? The reality of a 14-year-old girl is vastly different than the reality of a 65 or 75-year-old man, right? Biologically, psychologically, right? We change throughout our lives and we have different limitations that present themselves at those various stages of our life, right? It is not always consistent, okay? Um, so that reality that Saturn presents us is not always consistent in that sense. Like maybe gravity, yes, is a consistent one, right? The sun rising every day is, right? But ultimately, these things, other Saturnian realities, especially the biological ones, right, shift and change relative to who we are and where we are in our experiences. So so there's that part. Okay. And in mundane astrology, Saturn is related as well to various authorities, institutions of power, governments, like things we can point to and go, there's the Capitol building, there's the president, there's the prime minister, right? It is things that we can see, deal with, in our day-to-day sober waking experiences, basically. Okay. Now, Neptune, however, I think actually does deal with while I said it can deal with delusions and fantasy and paranoia and things that aren't actually real, it can actually deal with real things. In fact, some of Neptune's correlations on the mundane level can be things that are natural, like natural forces of the universe that just are overpowering to human beings. They overpower us. They're bigger than one person or even a huge human community can cope with or handle, right? So something like a hurricane, right? It's like we currently, right, we don't have the technology to stop a hurricane, right, or an earthquake. These are, hugely powerful forces of nature. Even a tornado, right? When these things show up in a city, in a town, right, it can cause immense devastation and we're kind of helpless to stop it, right? We can try to predict when these things might happen and we can prepare that way and evacuate areas and so forth. But ultimately, if we're caught, when a tsunami is coming, right, you just have to run, right? It's literally just this overpowering force of nature. And so Neptune, being God or goddess of the seas, of the ocean, symbolically, right, it is very much connected with that symbolism of water, but this huge body of water that is deeply overpowering and we get lost in it, right? So that very much is the symbolism in one way of Neptune, right? It can be very real things. In fact, even something like a virus, right? And that's important. We'll talk a little bit about that. A pandemic has a strong Neptunian correlation to it. And in fact, the Spanish flu, and I'll talk about that, I'll expand a little bit more, and I go into this in my article as well. The Spanish flu, which wasn't had anything to do with Spain specifically, that was just the name got attached to it for other political reasons. But basically, the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, that killed millions of people throughout the world and caused widespread sickness, and several waves of it were pretty severe. And I talk about the complexity of that as well in my article. But that actually started under the ending of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and they were actually pretty close in conjunction when those first outbreaks happened at the end of World War II. So I do think that the Saturn-Neptune cycle can actually relate to things like viral outbreaks and so forth, and we'll talk more on that. Okay, so that's kind of the mundane part of it. But beyond that as well, I do think that Neptune points as well to very even paranormal realities. I think, for example, things like ghosts and near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences and the UFO phenomenon. I feel like as an astrologer, someone who's interested in astrology and paranormal and synchronicity, I think these things point to a reality that does exist, but that is really outside of our ability to measure and make sense of and see the whole picture, right? It's like we have, for example, like the UFO phenomenon, which is a hugely complicated topic. Lots of, convoluted stuff with that. But, something like UFOs, which I think is a real legitimate phenomenon that is happening, and I think it's caught the government's attention for quite some time. And I do think there's something to it, right? It might not be the grand narrative that we hear from various conspiracy theorists or even UFO researchers. But it's like we have these glimpses of something going on that's bigger than us that we can't comprehend. It's like the blind man and the elephant metaphor, right? It's like everyone has this piece of something, but they can't quite grasp the bigger picture. And I think something like the UFO phenomenon points to that. It points to something that's happening. It's real, it's in our reality, but we cannot fathom it. It is just so beyond our human perception, right? Our Saturnian perception, right? Because as human beings, if you've tried things like psychedelics or have had a really profound altered state of consciousness, you would probably know or have experienced the fact that we're perceiving a very limited range of reality. And there is a lot more going on than, the kind of rosy picture of the current worldview, the materialist, secular materialist, scientific worldview kind of leads us to believe, right? So yeah, so I feel like that also is Neptune, right? Neptune points to something that's real, but we just can't fathom it. We can't fully grasp it. And even something like a virus, right, is very much like that. We've been studying viruses for like 50 years. Virology, is a handful of decades old. And while we've learned a lot about them, and we've learned, and science has really advanced us in our understanding of this, we really don't know that much because these things have been evolving for billions of years, right? And we have not even been around that long. Humans have been here for like a million years, right? We evolved from other primates, but to the hubris, right, to think that we can control these things and fully understand these things, I think is very hubristic. And I have some feelings that this cycle will connect into that as well. Okay, so with that said, right, Saturn and Neptune, the combination of this, and this is something that Tarnas described in his work as well, was this way in which Saturn symbolizes these concrete, definable barriers and boundaries in the world, right? Our government, our military, walls and borders, and maybe even in terms of our biology, right, our immune systems, right? It's like these these defenses that we can see and deal with and create ourselves and control, right? And Neptune symbolizes this force that can evade that, right? It's like this watery, literally like, right, Neptune, Poseidon, right? God of the seas, God of the ocean. It's this watery, malleable substance that can seep through these cracks and pores and weak spots and evade those defenses, right? And that's very much the symbolism of the cycle. And that's something Tarnas really did flesh out. Like one of the events that he talked about was during one of the oppositions of Saturn and Neptune was like Hurricane Katrina, right? And the way in which that hurricane revealed all of these weak spots in New Orleans and the city with the levees and government corruption and neglect and the horrific tragedy that led to, all the loss of life and property and devastation, and that has been, has had huge ramifications for people for years and years and years, right? Um, the way that cycle, right, revealed those weaknesses. So literally water, right, coming in through those boundaries and evading, right? So that very much fits the symbolism of Saturn and Neptune in a really huge way. So one other thing, right, is that this conjunction, right, is a merging of these two archetypes. And so it's like these two antithetical elements, right, coming together. And I really do think that it does have a lot to do with our perceptions of reality. These cycles have multidimensional ways that they emerge in the world from an astrological point of view. So there isn't any one particular manifestation, and there can be lots of correlative events and lots of different ways in which it shows up. So that even makes it even more complicated. Um, okay, so I think we got a good handle on the symbolism of these two archetypes. And again, I go into way more detail in my article with that. Okay, so back to the last square, right? So the last square was 2013, 2016. And this was the election of Donald Trump. And one of the examples that I talked about in my article, was the way in which many like so-called political experts, right, many, all these authorities of politics and political analysis, right, were like completely certain there was no way that Donald Trump and this populist movement that he had mobilized was going to win the election, right? And everyone really thought for sure, Hillary Clinton was going to win. And what ended up happening, right, was this total disillusionment, right? And everything, all the predictions were wrong. And it was this whole kind of like breakdown of reality in huge ways, right? And there was all of these different perceptions about what was happening, right? We had this rhetoric that Donald Trump was like this Hitler figure that was going to, create this fascist takeover of the country. And there were all these comparisons to like The Handmaid's Tale. And a lot more I can say about that, but I'm just going to present these different points of view, right? And from a lot of supporters of Trump, right, they believed that Trump was sort of like savior, right? He was going to, drain the swamp, was going to, totally shift the political arena and really change things. Like this was like a revolution to a lot of Trump supporters, right? Um, and they really believed he was going to change things economically was a huge thing. And one of my arguments, and I'm pretty liberal, progressive, civil libertarian, but I'm pretty open to different sides, and I like to look at different sides, and I think that's important to do, especially as astrologers. I think we should have that kind of holistic conception of things. But I think there was really from the side of Trump supporters, I think there were legitimate um, belief that he was going to change things economically because lots of people, right, who supported him really have felt economically disadvantaged and marginalized by things like globalization, neoliberalism, offshoring of jobs, rising living costs, the difficulty of securing employment that can make you enough to live. Like there's just a lot of oppressive economic conditions here for Americans that are very difficult. And I do think that was actually a huge motivation for why he won. People might disagree with me, but there was this whole kind of media framing of Donald Trump as this total racist. This was like a fascist movement and so forth, right? And there was these like vying of different perspectives, right? And it became really difficult to know what to believe, especially if you started to consider different sides of the perspective, right? So I think that is really significant. Another thing that I want to mention in relation to this is the whole conversation over misinformation or disinformation. And it's interesting, right? Because Donald Trump had used this rhetoric where he talked about fake news, right? And in a lot of ways, I think he was right. In some ways, maybe not so much. Um, but right, and then on the side of the government, right, the government has literally, since this period of time, actually started a war on misinformation, disinformation, or even what they call malinformation. And there is this actual campaign within the government. Well, there's actually an entire operation to basically censor and silence people who are spreading information the government deems to be false or dangerous, right? And this has really culminated during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, right? There was, doctors, scientists who came forward disagreeing with the mainstream narrative of what was happening or what we should do, right? Regarding things like lockdowns or mass vaccination or masking, right? And it was like anyone who had an opinion counter to the so-called science that was being promulgated by the authorities, right, were being deplatformed and silenced and banned from various social media platforms. And this was actually a part of a huge censorship program. And so there's actually a really interesting article on this by Jacob Siegel, and it is called the A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century. And this is a really interesting article. I highly recommend checking it out. And now Siegel is a part of a lot of journalists who have been uncovering what's called the Twitter files. And I know this is a hugely controversial topic, but if you read all of the work done on that, basically what they revealed was that the United States government was involved in basically sending requests to tech social media companies to basically silence or deplatform or ban certain people for things that they were saying online, right? And there was actually a direct line of communication between various factions of the government and these companies. And in some instances, the companies pushed back and didn't actually want to do this. And so this brings up a lot of questions around the First Amendment and freedom of speech, right? Because that First Amendment, of the U.S. Constitution is very explicit about allowing a lot of different kinds of speech, and regardless of whether or not you agree with it, right, that is a very core spirit of America, right? Is your right to say what you want. Like someone like me being an astrologer, there are lots of people who think I'm full of shit and I'm a charlatan and I should not be speaking and I shouldn't be talking about astrological information and that this could be dangerous, right? There's lots of people who would like to silence people like me, and actually have, right, in a lot of different ways, um, over the years. And so I believe I should have the right to share my worldview, even though you might not disagree with it, right? Or agree with it. And so anyway, I'm just going to quote a piece of Siegel's article, right? He says, since 2016, the federal government has spent billions of dollars on turning the counter-disinformation complex into one of the most powerful forces in the modern world, a sprawling leviathan with tentacles reaching into both the public and private sector, with government uses to direct a whole society effort that aims to seize total control over the internet and achieve nothing less than the eradication of human error. Okay, so this was like a little quote from his article. Um, basically what Siegel's referring to is actually an act that was passed by Obama just after Trump's election, right? Before he had left office as president, right? And this was the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act. And this was actually, signed in 2016 under that waning Saturn-Neptune square. And I think that's really interesting because this led to, right, according to Siegel's research and other journalists like Michael Schellenberger, this has led to a huge censorship apparatus that they actually compare to like the military industrial complex. In fact, they coin it as the censorship industrial complex. And personally, as a civil libertarian, I'm deeply concerned about this. I think this is very dangerous. I don't think that certain people in power should have the ability to silence, deplatform people that they want, right? Because, someone like me who has very controversial views could easily, get silenced as well, right? And I think that, as long as you're not provoking violence, and this is specific to the First Amendment, right? You're not, directly inciting violence, or like the murder of people, right? The First Amendment is pretty clear, right? It allows for lots of different types of speech. And I think it's very important. I'm a strong, protector of the First Amendment. I'll reveal some of my bias here. And I think this is going to be a very interesting time period, right? So this conjunction coming up, I think is really going to have a lot to do with, and one end, that, okay. And I do think we're likely to be faced with a crisis, with some serious issues that will emerge on the world stage that will bring this up, okay? And this whole conversation we've been having since this last square is really going to come into focus in a really big way. And I think that will be, a part of the confusion that will be happening in terms of not knowing what to believe, what's true, what isn't, what's going on, right? And now we're introducing things like AI, right? Artificial intelligence. All of this just makes this whole thing even more complicated, right? We already have this inundation of, AI produced images and information, and it can just add a lot more to the ability of governments or powerful people or anyone, right, to spread deceptive information as well, right? And I'm not saying that disinformation isn't a concern or that I'm not worried about it. I do think it's an issue. But I just deeply question, right, who's in charge of saying what is and what isn't disinformation, and so forth. And there's a huge conversation to have around that. And I get into that more into my article. But I did really wanted to point that out because I think that is going to be a very significant feature of this conjunction. Okay. Facing an issue in which, and there's lots of information coming out about it, and we don't really know what to believe. Okay. And that can be very concerning, right? Especially if you're dealing with something scary or potentially life-threatening, right? And you don't know what to do with it. Okay. So, so I want to put that on the table. Um, so, so basically, Tarnas's perception of the cycle and how this differs from Barbault in a way is that he compared it actually to similar to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have been writing about that, since 2016. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction happened aligned in 2020, and that was one of the alignments that drew a lot of astrologers' attention, myself included, as being a very significant year. In fact, André Barbault, right, writing years before it, also pointed that year out as being very significant and was very accurate. In fact, he directly predicted the potential of a pandemic in his work on it as well. Very interesting, and you can check that out even in Planetary Cycles that he published. So Tarnas described Saturn-Neptune periods as this kind of darkening of the collective consciousness, as he referred to it. So one of the things that I think is interesting, right, that these periods, right, face us with, crises and issues that emerge that can be very scary and uncertain, right, similar to what we experienced during the pandemic. And while I'm not, predicting another pandemic, or, I don't ultimately know, and I should have talked about that in the beginning if you're new to my work, which is that, right, these alignments, this empirical method of collecting data, right, presents us with a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different potentials that we might observe through history, right? And so it's really important to realize that, right? It's like we can't actually know specifically what will happen, right? So in my 2019 piece that I wrote about 2020, I did mention a pandemic as a possibility, but as well as alongside something like a world war or a major terrorist attack, there were lots of other correlations, right, that have happened throughout time with that cycle. So similarly with Saturn Neptune, right, there's a lot of correlations that have happened, and we don't really know exactly which ones it will be, right, or probably several. So keep that in mind, right? So this darkening of the collective consciousness, this comparison that Tarnas makes with the Saturn-Pluto cycle, I think is interesting. One thing he really pointed out, and again, I kind of already talked about this, right, is the way that there are these extreme, he says that under Saturn Neptune periods, there are these kind of extreme polarities that pop up in the culture, right? And this, can show up as like science versus religion, left versus right. And there's these very divisive moments, right? And again, we saw that pretty strongly in 2013, 2016 period, right? Um, Another thing that he talked about, right, was the death of ideals, right? The death of a dream. It's like something that, maybe large swaths of the population believe in, and the kind of collapse and dissolution of that, right? Going back to 1989, right? The whole, the Soviet Union, the communist regime of that period, right? That was a huge period of disillusionment collectively for that regime and under that war, right? And it really was this collapse of that ultimate vision, right? And while communist regimes still exist in the world and still have power, right? Um, it really did shift things in terms of what was going to be the dominant vision of at least of the world power, right? Other things, right, is like confrontations with events that can be really tragic and unsettling, something like a horrible tsunami or earthquake or pandemic or something that's unleashed, by nature and, large people succumb to it or injured, lose their lives, right? And this sort of, questioning of your faith in a higher power and like, why would God permit such horrible things to happen, right? Tarnas talked a lot about this and provided a lot of different events related to that. And again, I talk about some of those in my article too. So that also taps into that kind of death of a dream, of an ideal of how you see the world. So one other thing Tarnas mentioned I think is interesting, this ties back to 2013, 2016, is the reelection of George W. Bush, right, under another Saturn-Pluto cycle, right? And this, I think, was so similar to Donald Trump, right? A lot of people on the left we literally were like crying, grieving because Trump was elected, right? Because they really did believe this was like, Voldemort taking over Hogwarts. Like this was like, this was it. This was going to be the demise of American democracy. And there was, similarly, a lot of liberal voters, when George W. Bush was reelected, felt the same way. There was this kind of like disillusionment with the political system. And in fact, I would say, regardless of kind of what side you were on in terms of the election back in 2016, right? There was this sense of like disillusionment with the process for a lot of people. And I think still is. And I think this will also be a very interesting piece of this. Um, Okay, so another piece that Tarnas points out is the endings of war, and so Saturn Neptune periods correlating with that. So it's like dealing with the ramifications of a lot of loss, suffering, death, right, and the ending of a war basically, and seeing the mass casualties and the mass suffering that's come from that. And so I think that's really interesting because actually there were Saturn Neptune periods at the end of both world wars, and I already alluded to the Second World War and that, and then the start of the influenza pandemic at that time as well, right? And so there can be this, outpouring of grief and at the devastation, and that's a huge symbol of that as well. Tarnas did point out, though, however, during the Civil War, the American Civil War, during the 1861, 1865 Saturn-Neptune opposition, right? That entire war, for example, was fought during that Saturn-Neptune opposition. So it's not always the ending of it, but it can also be a situation like he referred to as this kind of like futile situation in which, like a battle is being waged and it doesn't seem like there's any way out of it. Like it's just like this very disheartening situation. And it can, he referred to it literally being like stuck in a quagmire, right? So that part is interesting too, right? It can also confront us with situations that seem futile, that seem like we're never going to overcome this, and this kind of sense of futility and exhaustion. So collective helplessness being also another symbol of that. One other thing I talked about in my article as well was the McCarthy era. And I think this is really interesting. This was during the 1950s, and this was also a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. And this ties into, as well, right, the history of communism throughout the world and its relation to the United States, right? And the McCarthy era, basically Senator McCarthy, right, had a list, basically, right, of supposed communists that were in government. And this just began expanding into what we refer to, right, what's referred to as blacklisting, right? So lots of Hollywood celebrities, high profile people were labeled to be communist sympathizers, right? And they were basically targeted, right, as being like enemies of the state. And one kind of interesting part of this history, though, that is often overlooked or a lot of people don't know about, is actually homosexuals were involved in this, were included as communist sympathizers, right? And so there was actually a whole campaign within the United States government to fire and out supposed, anyone suspected of being gay or lesbian, or potentially would include as well bisexual people, or even trans people could have been involved in that, even though those identities weren't solidified at that time. Right. And so lots of gay men, lesbian women lost jobs, lost their careers, were shunned from families and friends because they were targeted under this. And this actually, there's a very interesting body of work on this. George Chauncey, who wrote Gay New York, wrote a really good book on this as well that really goes into the history of this and the way that this led to the construction of homophobia, specifically in the United States. And I thought this correlation was really, really interesting because it's something we're still dealing with the ramifications of. And I think currently, right, the the larger LGBTQ plus movement that's emerged is a strong reaction to that extreme stamping down on homosexuality and the extreme homophobic sentiment that was promulgated at this period of time. And so hugely interesting history, because a lot of what we think has been kind of always the climate in the United States isn't quite true. It's actually quite a lot more nuanced. And this very extreme homophobic cultural sentiment really started under that period of time in the 1940s and 50s at the end of World War II. And so what I found really interesting about this, though, in relation to Saturn-Neptune cycles, right, was the way that like homosexuals were painted, as well as communists, right, as this like enemy that could be like anywhere, anyone. It could be someone you knew, it could be, your cousin, it could be your best friend, it could be your coworker, right? This like hidden enemy that was seeping in and intruding, right? This rhetoric propaganda under the McCarthy era literally painted, gay people as like trying to overthrow the government, and that they were organized, that they were going to they were basically infiltrating government positions, and we needed to find them out. And it was ended up being a total delusion, right? While there, of course, were, gay and lesbian people who were part of, radical groups, socialist groups, communist groups at the time, the vast majority of homosexuals were just like the ones today, myself included, right? Who are just living our lives, trying to just get by. And we're not probably, we're not conspiring with communist forces to overthrow the government, right? And so this was a very delusional period of time, right? There was all this paranoia over communists, taking over the country. And I think that correlation also is really, really interesting to consider, right? Because we've seen reflections of that, I think, in other periods of time, where there does seem to be this, paranoia about some hidden force coming in and not knowing where it could be, right? And that really strongly does fit with the Neptunian archetype. One thing I forgot to mention, right, is one correlation I like to, or metaphor I like to use with Neptune is that of hyper objects, and that comes from the philosopher Timothy Morton. And his idea of this is basically hyper objects are things that exist in the world, but they're like just so complicated and so beyond our ability to really pinpoint in time and space, right? They're like things like climate change or technological networks, or something like neoliberalism, right? Hypercapitalism is something that affects us all, and we all kind of know about and understand in some way, but there's no focal point to it. There's no central point to it, right? It's like, like with a Saturnian reality, right? Something like, oh, that's the Capitol building, that's the president, that's the White House. But something like technological networks, it's like, where's the central point, right? It's this very rhizomatic thing that's like spreading and spreading from various points and continues to spread throughout the world. And so that very much fits into that kind of Neptunian archetype, right? It's just something that's bigger than us, and it's just like, spreading all around and cropping up in random places, and there's really no way to contain it. Okay. Okay, one other theme that Tarnas brought up was dark nights of the soul, challenges to religious faith, and I kind of alluded to that as well. And Tarnas used the example of the mass genocide in Nazi concentration camps during the 1943-1945 Saturn-Neptune square. And that's interesting because that actually occurred as well on the Aries Point. And again, I'm not predicting that a genocide of that kind is going to happen, although currently, right, there's a whole controversy where many progressives, many supporters, Muslim people, right, are saying that Israel, right, is currently initiating a genocide in Gaza, and there have been mass casualties there from the terrorist attack that happened in Israel in October of last year, right? And so again, as well, like we could be seeing the large ramifications of that, happening and connecting with that as well. So that climate is already kind of being generated in the moment also, right? One of the things that I came up with in relation to the Spanish flu, and I want to get back to that because I think that's really interesting, was actually that was a period of a lot of disillusionment with medical science. There was a lot of loss of faith in scientific institutions. And the reason for that was because when that influenza virus was spreading, we did not have antibiotics, right? There was no effective vaccination. Medical technology was actually not able to protect people from that. And so as a result, lots and lots of people ended up dying and succumbing to that disease. In fact, lots of young people, there were a lot of young men, in fact, many who had fought in the war, who ended up perishing from those infections. And I go into some of the controversy over that because there's a lot of different hypotheses as to why that ultimately was, and it may not actually had entirely to do with the virus itself. It could have been a lot of other factors at the time. And that itself is really interesting, right? Because it was this thing that was happening. It was this, horrible, horribly infectious, deadly, virulent strain of influenza. When there was no way to stop it, there was no way to really protect people from it. But also it was like no one really knew what to do. And one of the hypotheses was, in fact, that many people were overdosed with aspirin. In fact, there's a really interesting paper published on this, and I cite that in my article, and you can check that out. But basically, there's documents to show that actually in hospitals, many doctors were administering very lethal doses of aspirin that actually led to like fluid retention in the lungs and exacerbated a lot of the conditions that people ended up dying from, especially the secondary bacterial infections. So that part's interesting, right? It was this like situation that was going on, and the medical system didn't really know how to handle it, and ended up actually over responding, and could have actually contributed to a lot of that mortality. And that part I think is interesting as well, right? Because it's like these periods of time can also present us with situations in which authorities, experts, right, end up being wrong. They end up being proven to not know what they're doing, right? Or failing, right, to defend the country or the people from the threat that's emerging. And therefore leading to a lot of disillusionment amongst the public in relation to those authorities. So that part I think is also really, really interesting. The last thing that Tarnas talks about that I think is really important involves drug scandals. And this part of it, I think, is important considering the climate we're currently in. One, we are, especially in the United States, right? We have a lot of direct marketing from pharmaceutical corporations to the public, right? There's commercials, there's ads on social media. This is actually illegal in a lot of other countries. And given the structure that I talked about, like neoliberal hypercapitalism, right? This way in which this has enabled a lot of private interests to have a lot of sway over government and other government institutions like public health even, right, creates a very concerning situation, right? When basically a pharmaceutical company can have a lot of power and influence over the basically the government response to a situation. Okay. Now, Tarnas pointed this out very specifically to periods under Saturn-Neptune in which there's a basically the surfacing of data that shows that something like a pharmaceutical company has distorted that data and lied to the public and even hid information. And one of the big examples that he used was the Vioxx scandal that happened in 2004 and 2007 under a Saturn-Neptune opposition. And this actually resulted that this drug, was basically like an anti-inflammatory drug that was being promoted at the time as an alternative to NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, excuse me. And in these initial trials, they actually emitted some deaths from this drug, and they ended up, pushing this to market and ended up getting FDA approval. And it was actually quite some time went on while this drug was on the market that it was revealed that this drug was actually leading to a high incidence of cardiovascular complications. In fact, basically around like 60,000 people died from this medication. That's a lot. Okay, so this was actually like the amount of casualties from like the Vietnam War. And it took quite a long time until this came to the public attention. Okay, it was like a 10-year period basically from its approval to the point that the FDA actually finally banned the drug from the market. But this involved a lot of manipulation on the part of the pharmaceutical company Merck that pushed this drug and basically emitting data from it, right? So so this led to, Tarnas to relate these periods as well to, right, the surfacing of side effects, reactions, long-term effects from things, and the corruption and manipulation that emerges from that. Okay. So again, I am not pointing to anything specific, but I am just saying it is very interesting. There have been a lot of recent interventions that have happened as a result of the pandemic. There has been huge controversies over how to treat this specific virus amongst lots of different doctors. Like there's a lot of alternative doctors, many who have been silenced, who are saying, things like repurposed drugs should have been used early on, have been really effective, and that has been silenced from the public and so forth. And so anyway, that is a very interesting correlation as well. Okay, so that is quite a lot. I go way more into that in my article, and you can check that out. I have a lot of citations, a lot of sources for all the stuff that I'm talking about there. So if you want to dig more into that, you can. Okay, so I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to shift to André Barbault. Now, Barbault found a very interesting correlation with these cycles, and basically what he referred to as well, specifically in relation to the conjunction, he says, this conjunction is about popular insurrections that are usually fired by ideological beliefs. Okay, this is like page 88 of Planetary Cycles, Mundane Astrology by André Barbault. And I thought this was really interesting. And he actually tracks this throughout history, especially in relation to communism and Marxism and the spread of socialist ideals and communist ideals throughout the world, and that there is this very direct correlation with various insurrections that tend to emerge around these cycles. And he specifically pointed to the conjunction. So that is interesting, right? And we have, again, these rumors about or these fears, right, within our culture here in the United States, right, about, the Trump movement. And I'm not saying that that is ultimately what will happen. I don't know. Personally, my view on that is very, very nuanced. I think there is a lot of disinformation coming from a lot of media sources and left-leaning people and the government itself. And I think it's all very convoluted. But that part was interesting. He points to, 1989, right? That was the revolution in Eastern Europe, that which led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Something like the Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1773, which was, the colonial revolt against the British monarchy, and that, paved the way for the American independence. Also happened under a Saturn Neptune cycle, literally the birth of Marxism, communism, and then various stages of that becoming, a realized political force in the world was related to these cycles. Again, the collapse of the Soviet Union, what actually happened in 1991, also occurred under a Saturn Neptune cycle. But that also included as well Uranus, which had actually been crossing over the Aries point up in Capricorn as well. And that part is interesting. Another thing he pointed to was class conflicts. So, these periods where there's this very stark divide between rich and poor, right? And that piece I think is really, really interesting because, basically that would be my argument as to what neoliberal hypercapitalism leads to is this, horrific wealth inequality, right? This is something, Bernie Sanders and his leftist populist movement that he mobilized back in that 2013, 2016 period, that was the main thing that he ran on, right? Was talking about the one percenters, right? This small faction of elite people who have all this wealth and power, and the disparities that that creates for working class Americans, and how we funnel all this money towards things like stock buybacks and corporate incentives and bail out corporations whenever they mess up the stock market, right, or fail. And so all this tax money is funneled towards propping up the market, right? And that comes at the expense of even things like giving healthcare to Americans or free education and so forth, right? So that also is interesting. And I think that could also be another huge, huge, significant conversation that will likely crop up and be a turning point with the conjunction in 2025 and 2026. Okay, so I want to talk about the one last thing that Barbault talked about. And again, his analysis is very extensive, but he was very specific in tracking this relation to these cycles and these communist ideals, or even this kind of like more humanitarian focus on supporting the working class, right? Regardless of what you think is the ultimate outcome of those ideologies or whether those actually work or not. There were critical turning points in history in Europe and even in the United States related to these communist socialist ideologies. Okay, so he really fixated a lot on that in his work. But I do want to point out one thing that he had said about this cycle. And so, if you read my article, right, it's a little dire in the sense, right? It's pretty dark, right? And I expanded a lot on Richard Tarnas's work, and I think there's a lot of accuracy to that. And I do think that that's likely to emerge on the world stage in some way. And I think we're already going to get in there, right? If we're using this 15-degree orb, 2024 through 2027 is going to be the totality of that Saturn-Neptune cycle. But it was really interesting, though, that Barbault had noted that because there were really supportive aspects to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction from basically, he pointed out that the next conjunction in 2026 is centrally placed at the beginning of Aries and is in a triangular quartet of planets with a double sextile to a trine between Uranus and Gemini and Pluto and Aquarius, right? So he was noting these supportive aspects from Pluto and Uranus to this conjunction, right, which is true. I will note that Neptune and Pluto have been kind of locked into this, sextile for quite a while, actually, since I believe the First World War. And I know there's been some conversation about that with astrologers as being symbolic of this kind of period of world stability, world peace. And as this conjunction breaks away, that may begin to break down. Although again, world peace is nuanced because it kind of depends on where you are. Definitely not the Middle East, but in terms of the major civilizations, I guess, right? So that alignment actually, they've been actually locked into that sextile for quite a while. So personally, I'm not sure I see that as hugely significant in mitigating this. I will note that the Aries the Eris Chiron conjunction, which, by the way, also happened during the Spanish flu in that 1918-19 period on the Aries Point, by the way. So Chiron and Eris aligned then as well. This coming up in 2025 and 2026. Excuse me, I'm going to drink some hibiscus for a minute. So that conjunction actually makes a square, a hard aspect to Pluto, right? And this Eris has been in square to Pluto for a while. In fact, this was featured, in 2020, and I felt that correlation was prominent then too. And I talk about that in my article, and it's a little unsettling, but I do have a higher, kind of spiritual interpretation of that, of what the ultimate purpose of this is. Okay, so I go into that and talk about that, the more positive meaning of it. Okay, so to quote Barbault again, right? He basically says, in relation to the Saturn Neptune conjunction, he says it is the most benefic configuration of the century, and its interplanetary partnership will work for the best in a splendid relaunch of civilization. It contains a harmonious relationship between primordial polar opposites, the coming together of the external and the internal, rational and spiritual, mind and soul, human beings surpassing themselves while experiencing life on a higher level. So Barbault basically was saying that this was going to be a really positive period. And he literally says it's the most benefic configuration of the century, and talks about this being a relaunch of civilization. So while, my analysis of the cycle, and then if you, look at Tarnas's work in relation to it, would say, this looks a little tough, right? This looks like we're heading towards a very interesting crossroads, maybe for the human species. And I think Barbault's relaunch of civilization statement is really interesting. Now, if you studied astrology or have actually done this research yourself or have practiced astrology at all, I'm talking about this empirical method of gathering data and finding patterns, and that's, I think, important. I think that's really cool, and I think it's actually revolutionized the ability of modern astrologers to make very specific archetypal predictions about the future, right? I want to be clear about that, right? We're not predicting literal events, although we might throw out possibilities. And I think that empirical approach is really important. But also, I do think we're dealing with, in a way, some altered state of consciousness or some hyper-dimensional realm. Like, we're tapping into stuff. And I do believe astrologers sometimes will channel things through their work. I experience this a lot in readings. That's like I get into the flow of a reading, and it's like things just come out and they end up being really accurate. And it's supported by the astrology, but it's not something I would just rationally come to, right? So I want to give Barbault credit for that, because I think as a very experienced astrologer, and I highly respect his work, and I think his work is amazing, and he has paved the way for modern mundane astrology in a huge, huge, huge way, and deserves credit for that. I think he may be onto something with that, right? And I'm not sure if that relaunch is going to ultimately be pleasantly experienced necessarily. But I think that statement that just jumped out at me. And when I first read it, and was just like, interesting. And there's all these conversations right now happening about this reset, right? This great reset going on. And there's a lot of, conspiracy theories about, depopulation agendas and so forth. And that, the elite controllers of the world are plotting to sort of reset civilization in various ways. And as an astrologer, I would just say it's useful to kind of look at that conversation as as an archetypal one, right? There's this sort of archetype of needing to dramatically change the direction we're going as a civilization, right? Regardless of what actually happens, I do think that conversation is important. I do think that, we are unleashing things into the world that are very powerful, very dangerous, right? We were at, I think, a very interesting precipice for humanity. And this started a long time ago. Okay, this started with the advent of nuclear weapons and so forth. But I do think with especially computer technologies, right, we have things like quantum computing that is on the rise. We have, mRNA vaccinations, right? We're dealing with tampering with genetics. We are developing artificial intelligence, AI. In fact, a lot of these conversations also tap into Pluto and Aquarius, and I will be doing some podcasts and YouTube videos on that as well. And I've written an article on that too, and you can check that out on my website. But yeah, I do think we are unleashing some very powerful technologies, tools, and forces that have the capacity to radically change life on this planet and could even lead, to threatening our own extinction, right? Again, conversations about things like climate change, and technologies and things that we have the ability to dramatically accelerate us towards a more positive direction or devolve us into a more negative direction. And so, I don't want to hype this conjunction up as like, this is the determining moment of civilization, but I do think it will be a very interesting one. And I do think that there will be some very interesting situations that will emerge that will bring to light a new way of looking at reality. Now, one of the things that I argued in my article, the title of my article was From Disillusionment to Global Awakening. And what I meant by that wasn't that I felt that the Saturn-Neptune conjunction was going to lead to this enlightened mass enlightenment, or everyone is going to become hyper aware and hyper consciousness, and we're going to ascend into some higher dimension. What I simply meant by that was really that I think we are in dire need of a shift in our worldview, in our understanding of what is happening in the world. Okay. In fact, Tarnas, argued this. The subtitle of his book, was Intimations of a New Worldview, right? And I agree with this. I think things like astrology, and this kind of research is really important because I think it does point to the fact that we don't really understand reality the way that we think it is, or we think we do, right? There is a lot going on here that is actually pretty incredible and pretty miraculous. And the implications of something like astrology working, suggests that we are tapped into and interconnected in ways that are so beyond our comprehension. It's really profound. And I believe that people really understood that they were deeply connected to everything in this universe, and that everything that they do is deeply connected to everything else. And it's like what you do to anything else, you do to yourself, right? And this understanding that we are ultimately all in this together and we are all one consciousness, I think is really profound. And I think it's something that we should really tap more into. And I understand we live in the Saturnian world, right? And it's very nuanced, and there's times where we have to break out of that to defend ourselves or to stand up for what we believe in. But ultimately, I really do feel that we as a human species dramatically need a change in our worldview. And it may turn out that Barbault is onto something. I think that the relaunch of civilization may happen through a very dramatic shift in how we see reality and how we understand things, power dynamics, nature, the universe, all of it. I think there will be some very interesting turning points in relation to that. And I think through disillusionment, through having to face a lot of things that are not true that we might have believed are true, and coming through that, I think we'll come out actually with a more expansive, holistic understanding of the world we live in. And I think ultimately that is a good thing. And so while I think the cycle will present us with some very challenging issues and events, I think it is for the best ultimately, even though that might be painful for portions of the planet or large swaths of people. But ultimately, I don't know what will emerge. Okay, so I want to end this conversation with pulling a random tarot card. And I've been wanting to do this, and I was debating whether or not I should because I wasn't sure what was going to come up, but I thought I was just going to trust the moment and use this card as a archetype of this alignment and as a message for humanity of what we should expect. And then we can explore this card, to give us insight into how to best navigate it in a way. And I know that's a lot to ask for one tarot card, but I don't know. I just thought I'd try it out and see what comes up. So I have my Cosmic Tarot deck. This is actually the first tarot deck that I ever got, and so I've been using it for almost 20 years now. So I'm going to do a quick shuffle of the deck and um, pull a tarot card live. Well, not live, but on this recording, basically. So if you're watching in the video, I have the cards here. I'm just going to quickly shuffle them. And um, okay, one just like popped out like right there. Okay. Okay. Oh, that gave me chills. Wow. Um, I'm going to take a moment with this because so for those listening to on the podcast, I pulled the Seven of Cups. In the Cosmic Tarot, this is the image of a man who's basically kind of doing a like a yoga pose. Like oh, what is the name of it? I'm trying to think of it. Child pose. Okay, yeah. So he's basically on his knees and he is folded over, his arms are stretched out, and behind him are seven cups. And in the background is an image of a man kissing a woman who seems to be looking away. She's not really engaging with him. She's looking off to the distance. To the side of that is another face of a woman. It's like side of her face. There's an eye. You see a book, a sword, a pentacle, and this is in reference to the elements of the tarot deck. One of the cups, actually, so these cups are kind of scattered around him. One has a crown on top, one is filled with worms, one has a rose in it. Um, and it's very dark, it's very dreary, right? This card is very interesting because of everything I was just talking about, right? This is a card of being consumed by fantasy, by delusions, by figments of your imagination. This is often a card about, needing to kind of wake up from a dream, from a false reality, right? And it can even talk about, being stuck somewhere because we're not seeing things clearly or we're not practically dealing with reality or the situation, right? So this can be a card of longing for something that's past, that's no longer there. Um, yeah, so that's really interesting. Yeah. And I think, it's, to me, this card is very haunting. It's like being haunted by images of the past or what could have been um, versus what is. And it really does deal emotionally, right? It's an emotional card, right? The cups is the emotional realm. It's the water realm, right? Very Neptunian. So that is interesting. I think I'm going to explore this a little bit more. I don't think I've done it fully justice, but I invite you to, if you want, yeah, explore the meaning of this card yourself, reflect on it. What could this mean for the world, for us coming up? How is this card significant? And that's just my kind of logical connection to the card. It's not a great card. It's not a pleasant card to show up in a reading. I mean, depending on surrounding cards. But hmm, yeah, interesting. Disinformation, misinformation, paranoia, delusions, all of that would tie into this card in a really big way. Let me know what you think. In fact, if you're on YouTube, comment what you think of this card, or even my interpretation of it. I might do more with this, so we will see. Okay, I think I've gone on long enough. I wish you all well, and I hope you found this insightful. I know ultimately I provided kind of a more negative view of this, I think, if I'm working with Tarnas's research. But, in my article, I go more into the positive potential. I did talk about that as well. And I think, this will be a critical time for humanity in a lot of big ways. And I think waking up from a dream of sorts is a part of that. And I think we'll be faced with situations that will very much prompt us collectively to question our reality and what we believe to be true and what isn't. And I think that will be a huge conversation in a variety of ways. So we will see. I will plan on doing maybe more discussions on this, of course, as we get closer to this alignment and reflect more on the symbols and so forth. So until then, I hope you found this helpful and insightful. check out my website. I link that down below. You can subscribe to my free newsletter. I send that out bi-weekly. You can also subscribe to my podcast, my YouTube channel. Like the video if you'd like to send me a comment. Share the video. That's very helpful. All of that helps my work to get out there. And until next time, take care.